Hello, everyone, and welcome to the week of February 20th. This is our fifth week. I know it's been a lot of work so far. We have a couple of weeks to go until it starts to ease up a little bit. So, this week we're talking about the issues in substance abusing families. Um, Domestic violence is one of the first things mentioned in the chapter. A lot of scary statistics here on this page. Um, Domestic violence is a huge problem in our world, but and in our country. Every minute in the U.S., 20 people are experiencing intimate partner violence. Most domestic violence cases are men as the perpetrator and women as the victim. However, that's not always the case. There are a lot of domestic or intimate partner violence situations where the man is actually the victim, and it's there's so much stigma he may not step forward to report. There's also in same-sex relationships, especially two men in a relationship, there can be a lot of intimate partner violence. A lot involve substance use. Alcohol is a drug of anger, and that is many times involved in domestic violence situations. Um, this is a movie about the power and control wheel, um, and it's a very um, hard video to watch. Um, if you find it triggering, you can stop watching it. You should stop watching it. However, you should really go and get treatment for that, because you will be talking to people who have either been victims of domestic violence or they're struggling with anger and they're perpetrators of domestic violence. So it's not something you can kind of avoid in the field. So if you have been a victim and you're triggered, you should go get treatment, talk to your supervisor, um, go to therapy yourself so that you can be in a place where you're not going to be um, triggered by it. This video I like because you may remember a couple weeks ago, there was a video, and one of my favorite quotes was, "It's not enough to be cognitively aware. You need to be behaviorally and emotionally aware." And I feel like this video does that. So here you go.
Domestic abuse is one of the most widespread crimes in America. Even after decades of dedicated efforts to educate, support, and protect victims and survivors, hundreds of thousands, mostly women, are abused, battered, and killed by their husbands and partners. Most abusers follow a pattern, usually beginning by controlling in small ways, then escalating their control until frequently every step a victim takes is under her abuser's scrutiny. It's all about power and control. This pattern is clearly illustrated through the use of a graphic known as the Power and Control Wheel, developed by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs of Duluth, Minnesota. The words physical and sexual violence appear on the outside of the wheel, but physical and sexual violence may or may not be part of an abusive relationship. Often, the threat of violence, or a single episode of violence, will effectively control a victim. An abuser may use physical or sexual violence, or intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children or male privilege, economic abuse, or coercion and threats. This program contains a series of interviews with friends, relatives, and victims and survivors of domestic abuse. Using their stories and the Power and Control Wheel, you'll get a glimpse of how abusers control their victims. We'll begin with the use of intimidation.
He had put 2 bullets up on the mantelpiece in the apartment, and so every time she walked by, she saw those. And that was, and he did say to her, "If you leave," he said, "I will kill you." And so she had that hanging over her head. Plus, if you say anything to anybody. So she lived in that fear. And the children that lived in the house saw those, and they knew the fighting that went on. And that's the constant prison that you live in. Yes, she came and went to work, but a lot of people didn't know what was going on inside those walls until they heard the arguing or they saw her come out.
We were at a restaurant in Bangor, and he just said a slew of horrible things to me about the way he treats her. That if she doesn't follow the rules, she knows what's going to happen. And she's already suffered, but it keeps her in line and things like that. And she was just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in the chair. And I was just sitting there with my mouth wide open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then he says, very casually, "Excuse me, I have to go to the restroom."
She was very outgoing, just a very loving person. And afterwards, that she was kind of overly submissive to him, and he just dominated her life.
He would get up early in the morning, and he would sit downstairs, and he would kind of like obsess about things that were bothering him that he felt I had done wrong, and then he would start drinking, and by the time I got up, he was in a full-blown rage, and he would start following me around the house and just keep asking me these same questions over and over again and getting more and more, upset and louder and in my face. And I would do anything to get away from him or to try and appease him. I'd ask him to stop, and I'd beg him to stop, and I'd plead with him, and I would cry. And
I was 16, and thought I was in love. There was a lot going on in my life, and I'd met this guy, and I thought we'd seen each other, and I thought he loved me. He would have people say that they had slept with me and that the baby wasn't even his. And I had been a virgin. I was not loose. And I just didn't think that that was right. But I still felt that he loved me, and maybe if I showed him that I loved him and I was a little bit better, he would stop, but he didn't. It just escalated.
He could tell her where she'd go, when she would go. When I would try to get her on the phone, he would be there and tell her what to say back. Tell her what she could wear, what she couldn't wear. Things had to be his way.
She had lost all her friends. She had stopped talking to everybody in the family. The first thing he did when he saw how much that Heather and I cared about each other, he turned to Heather and he said to her, "Maybe I slept with her." And which was not true in any way, shape, or form. So right there, he immediately drove a wedge between Heather and my relationship. Right there. I mean, she fell apart. And from that moment on, I could tell that she wasn't quite sure if she wanted to trust me or not.
We found out later that when Matthew and Lisa went out and she wanted to go to the ladies' room, he would escort her right to the ladies' room door and then escort her back to where they were, just domineering all the time.
He wanted to know where I was at all times. And as I said, I wasn't allowed to see the people that I used to see, that I used to hang around with. I had to hang around with him and his family.
Jeffrey had never allowed Mindy to get a license. He took her anywhere she wanted to go, according to him. So she didn't need a license. Because we all found out later on that it was all part of his control mechanism to try, to determine where she was and who she was seeing.
It's over a period of time that they isolate you from your friends and your family. And I learned early on in our relationship that those types of conversations with friends, he had overheard me once talking to a friend, and afterwards I was punished severely for that. And so I learned those types of things are private. You don't talk about. Wasn't supposed to talk about my relationship with him to other people. It was private. It wasn't allowed. So I kept it all, I didn't share it with anybody. I didn't go to anybody. I didn't talk to my doctor about it. I didn't tell anybody. I think he still believes to this day it was all my fault. Everything bad in his life is my fault. After the abuse, they're the ones that are there for you and tell you, I'm so sorry and I love you, and they're, taking care of you. So it's really hard to understand this person who was just beating you 2 hours later is the one who's taking care of you and cleaning up your wounds and your bruises and everything. So it's just a lot of crazy making stuff in your head.
She would be submissive, and very often I would see things that I didn't like, and she said, no. She said, it's my fault. Whatever happened there was my fault, not his. And I'd think to myself, I don't see that. We went skiing one time in Montage Mountain in Pennsylvania, and they had, of course, the bunny slope there, and Lisa had never skied before, and the ski instructor was a young, good-looking guy, and you could just see Matthew just steaming and boiling inside. And they were going to go back the next day and do some more skiing, and that just never happened. And I'd say, Lisa, why not? Oh, it's my fault. We're not going because it's my fault, and it wasn't.
I knew I was a good person. I knew I was a morally upright person, but he made me feel that I was, lower than dirt, and that I was scum of the earth. Well, one day my sister, my oldest sister, and my brother-in-law tried to come and get me. He had beat me really bad, and I called my sister and I said, please come and get us. And I had gone to a different house down the road, and when they came to get me, he had arrived back home because he had taken off after he'd beat me. He arrived back and he saw who was coming down the road, so he knew I was trying to escape. And he came and he grabbed my daughter out of my hands and he said, you're not taking her. You'll never see her again. So I had to stay. I wasn't going to let him raise my baby.
When I got there, the police had just arrived, had set up some crime scene tape. And I was there at least to make sure that our girl didn't have to come onto the scene and find her 22-month-old son in that horrendous, bloody bedroom. Changed everything really in just a split second. Went from a nice, peaceful, beautiful December reality to a nightmare. A nightmare that to some extent continues even now. It was something that was unreal to me. I couldn't understand the taking of any life. But I really, really couldn't understand how somebody could take a innocent child and hold him down and shoot him in the back of the head.
I think there's still that the man is the boss and the woman is supposed to listen and obey and do what she is told. But that isn't how it's supposed to be. Love isn't supposed to leave bruises. It isn't supposed to destroy.
We would have conversations, we would talk, and he would answer. He would not let her speak. Why can't Heather answer that question? Because I know what she's going to say. She and I think alike. Okay, I'd like to hear from her mouth. And she would be hesitant.
Before, you couldn't, you couldn't keep her quiet about anything. And when he became part of her life, that part of her completely went. And she started to become very quiet. And her posture changed. Instead of being very upright, she started to really cave in, physically cave in.
She never looked up. She never looked you in the face. And he, most of the time spoke for her, and then she would just repeat what he said. You could see that look in her eye that she really had an opinion about it, but the words that came out of her mouth were his. She was working at the hospital in Bangor, and she was working in the food department with the goal that at the time that if you worked at the hospital for so many years, you would become eligible to go into some sort of nursing program, so school. And she wanted to do that. She wanted to do it really bad. And she started working towards that goal. Every day he would go to the hospital and sit there and make a scene in the cafeteria. And it made things very difficult for her at work because she was then getting in trouble with her bosses because she couldn't get out of a fight, really, in public even. And then sometimes he would just sit there and stare at her. What ended up happening was that 1 week shy of her being eligible for the nursing program, he made her quit. He made her quit her job.
There were times when we would send up money. The problem with the money was he would take it and use it for his own personal uses. Finding ways not to go out and get a job and use the money for maintaining his lifestyle, shall we say, if you want to call it that. When we opted to, when we found this out, send up gift cards for specific things in places that had the might need. He would go out and he would spend the money at the store, buy something there, and then he would return it and get cash so he could spend the cash himself.
I mean, she didn't have a crib. She didn't have blankets. She didn't have anything because he said that was a waste of money. So she packed her bags. And I imagine from things that he said to me, because he's flat out said to me multiple times that he would not allow her to leave.
Evidently, from what I understand, he had 2 bullets sitting on the mantelpiece of the apartment for a week before. So every time she'd walk by, she would see these because he had told her if she'd ever leave him, that he would kill her. So she lived in that fear, and that's why I think she never left.
He's tried to kill me numerous times. He'd come at me with knives and threatened to slit my throat. And this is after he'd beat me. Then he's put a gun to my head once, and he said, "This is the gun I'm going to use to kill you." And I still stayed because the threat was that I would never see my little girl again. And then when I did dare to leave, he would stalk me. He would be wherever I was.
He'd grab me by, I had long hair then, grab me by the hair and drag me out to the garage, which is a detached garage that's across the driveway, and throw me against the wall in there and close the garage door. So, of course, then my daughter couldn't see, the neighbors couldn't see, and just get in my face. And, they have this tendency to, I don't know, to me, you're looking back at it, it's like he would puff up and his eyes would bulge out, and face would be contorted with rage. And, he'd ask a question and he didn't get the answer he wanted, so he would just, slap me across the face, and I would cower down, and he would pull me back up by the hair and ask his questions again and slap me. And then he'd, throw me down on we have a cement floor, throw me down, kick me. I still can't believe he did this, but he grabbed my breast at one point and just twisted it as hard as he could. And then it would, it's very distressing to talk about this.
according to the police, she packed a bag and headed for the door. And he came at her at the door with a small knife. And she saw it coming. So she tried to block him from getting her, and she had multiple defensive wounds in her hands as she tried to push him off. But he kept coming at her, and she had small, not very deep cuts in her shoulders as she tried to back up, and a couple in her chest area. She realized she wasn't getting out of there, but she wanted Jonah to live, her baby, her son. So she turned around and ran into the corner and turned her back to him and put her arms around her belly to protect him.
So they were inside the house arguing, and Brenda had said to him, you know, I've had it, I need a break, I need to just go away for a while. And that was when the first shot was fired. And he hit her in the stomach. She was able to run out of the house. Meanwhile, her daughter's sitting on the front steps. So her mother runs by her. She gets across the street. Her husband comes out, stops long enough to reload the rifle, shoots her in the back of the head. She's gone.
If we're silent, if we don't do anything about the violence that exists around us, if we don't begin a dialogue, if we don't begin communicating with our sons and the other young men and boys in our lives about their emotional development, about violence in our world and how it's expressed, then inevitably the cycle will repeat.
Most of the people that I've met, what they need is a lifeline. Somebody that they know they can talk to, go to, where there's a safe place.
If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, call 911. There are trained advocates who can assist victims and survivors of abuse and provide support and information to family members, friends, co-workers, and other community members. The call and assistance is free and confidential.
That's a hard video to watch, I know. Every time I watch it, I still get upset, especially when that woman in pink starts talking. You can see how activated she is, like how she kind of goes back into the memory and she's reliving it, and that's tough. That's kind of a dissociative state, which you'll probably learn about when you're doing when you do the individual counseling course. So domestic violence usually happens in this kind of cycle of abuse. There's a honeymoon period, apologies, promises, blaming, gifts, and then the tension builds, criticism, yelling, swearing, coercion, anger, and then the explosion where attacks and threats happen, physical, emotional, sexual, and then it's back to the honeymoon period. Reasons victims stay, conflicting emotions. There's a part of them that is fearful and a part of them that still loves the person or wants to love the person or sees that part of that the perpetrator that is a kind part, even though there's this violent part. Shame, it's embarrassing and shameful. They look at it as something's wrong with me for him to be able to, or her to be able to treat me this way. Safety concerns, as you see with the video, like can be really risky to take the chance to leave. Lack of money and resources, depression and isolation, cultural or religious pressures, custody worries, and a fear of being deported. Those are all very prevalent, this fear of being deported. So this is a video by Jackson Katz. He trains NFL teams and the U.S. military on violence against women. He's an excellent speaker, and I think this is a video that I know really woke me up to a new way of thinking about this, and I hope you'll also learn a lot from it.
Before I begin my presentation, I want to say it's a great honor for me to be part of a program with so many impressive women. I also want to say, and thank you to the organizers to invite me to be part of this. It's important that I say, and that men say, when we do the work that we do, and especially in the field of gender violence prevention that I'm going to talk with you about this morning, it's important that we acknowledge that the growing movement of men in the United States, in a multicultural sense, and all around the world in an international sense, the growing movement of men who are standing up and speaking out about men's violence against women and going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them. That movement of men is indebted to the leadership of women on a personal level, on a professional level, on a political level, on an intellectual level, on every level. Women built these movements, and these are movements that are affecting, in a positive way, everybody, not just women and girls, but also men and boys. And oftentimes men like myself get a lot of credit and public acclaim for doing the work that women have been doing for a long time. So one of the ways that we can use the spotlight is to thank women and honor women's leadership going forward today, tomorrow, and into the future. Now, having said that, I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, that whole range of issues that I'll refer to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, they're also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention. Right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out and we think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls or that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. So let's talk for a moment about race. In the US, when we hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to. Right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by by John, and now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John, it's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women, okay? It's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. You can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why do so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church or the Penn State football program or the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, and then local communities all over the country and all the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why do so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why do so many men rape other men? What is going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abusive men at pandemic rates? Because this isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way to understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. You know, the perpetrators aren't these, monsters who crawl out of the swamp and come into town and do their nasty business and then retreat into the darkness. That's a very naive notion, right? Perpetrators are much more normal than that and everyday than that. So the question is, what are we doing here and in our society and in the world? What are the roles of the various institutions in helping to produce abusive men? What's the role of religious belief systems, the sports culture, the pornography culture, the family structure, economics and how that intersects, and race and ethnicity and how that intersects? How does all this work? And then once we start making those kind of connections and asking those important and big questions, then we can talk about how can we be transformative? In other words, how can we do something differently? How can we change the practices? How can we change the socialization of boys and the definitions of manhood that lead to these current outcomes? These are the kind of questions that we need to be asking and the kind of work that we need to be doing. But if we're endlessly focused on what women are doing and thinking in relationships or elsewhere, we're not going to get to that piece. Now, I understand that a lot of women who have been trying to speak out about these issues today and yesterday and for years and years often get shouted down for their efforts. They get called nasty names like male basher and man hater and the disgusting and offensive feminazi, right? And you know what all this is about? It's called kill the messenger. It's because the women who are standing up and speaking out for themselves and for other women, as well as for men and boys, it's a statement to them to sit down and shut up. Keep the current system in place because we don't like it when people rock the boat. We don't like it when people challenge our power. You better sit down and shut up, basically. And thank goodness that women haven't done that. Thank goodness that we live in a world where there's so much women's leadership that can counteract that. But one of the powerful roles that men can play in this work is that we can say some things that sometimes women can't say, or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women often can't be heard saying. Now, I appreciate that's a problem, it's sexism, but it's the truth. And so one of the things that I say to men, and my colleagues and I always say this, is we need more men who have the courage and the strength to start standing up and saying some of this stuff. And standing with women, not against them, pretending that somehow this is a battle between the sexes and other kinds of nonsense. We live in the world together. And by the way, one of the things that really bothers me about some of the rhetoric that against feminists and others who have built the battered women's and domestic and rape crisis movements around the world is that somehow, like I said, that they're anti-male. What about all the boys who are profoundly affected in a negative way by what some adult man is doing against their mother, themselves, their sisters? What about all those boys? What about all the young men and boys who have been traumatized by adult men's violence? You know what? The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. And if we want to talk about male victims, let's talk about male victims. Most male victims of violence are the victims of other men's violence. So that's something that both women and men have in common. We are both victims of men's violence. So we have it in our direct self-interest, not to mention the fact that most men that I know have women and girls that we care deeply about in our families, in our friendship circles, and every other way. So there's so many reasons why we need men to speak out. It seems obvious saying it out loud, doesn't it? Now, the nature of the work that I do and my colleagues do in the sports culture, in the US military, in schools, we pioneered this approach called the bystander approach to gender violence prevention. And I just want to give you the highlights of the bystander approach because it's a big sort of thematic shift, although there's lots of particulars. But the heart of it is, instead of seeing men as perpetrators and women as victims, or women as perpetrators, men as victims, or any combination in there, I'm using the gender binary. I know there's more than men and women. There's more than male and female. And there are women who are perpetrators, and of course there are men who are victims. There's a whole spectrum. But instead of seeing it in the binary fashion, we focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And a bystander is defined as anybody who is not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, co-workers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer culture relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak up? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. We're not just saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop the guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum we're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So for example, if you're a guy and you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. It could be my, sister you're talking about, and could you joke about something else? Or could you talk about something else? I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Just like if you're a white person and another white person makes a racist comment, I hope, that white people would interrupt that racist enactment by a fellow white person. Just like with heterosexism, if you're a heterosexual person and you yourself don't enact harassing or abusive behaviors towards people of varying sexual orientations, if you don't say something in the face of other heterosexual people doing that, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity? Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak up and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. And if we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse, because the typical perpetrator is not sick and twisted. He's a normal guy in every other way, isn't he? Now, among the many great things that Martin Luther King said in his short life was, in the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the end, what'll hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. There's been an awful lot of silence in male culture about this ongoing tragedy of men's violence against women and children, hasn't there? There's been an awful lot of silence. And all I'm saying is that we need to break that silence, and we need more men to do that. Now, it's easier said than done, because I'm saying it now, but I'm telling you, it's not easy in male culture for guys to challenge each other, which is one of the reasons why part of the paradigm shift that has to happen is not just understanding these issues as men's issues, but they're also leadership issues for men. Because ultimately, the responsibility for taking a stand on these issues should not fall on the shoulder of little boys or teenage boys in high school or college men. It should be on adult men with power. Adult men with power are the ones we need to be holding accountable for being leaders on these issues. Because when somebody speaks up in a peer culture and challenges and interrupts, he or she is being a leader, really, right? But on a big scale, we need more adult men with power to start prioritizing these issues. And we haven't seen that yet, have we? Now, I was at a dinner a number of years ago, and I work extensively with the U.S. military, all the services. And I was at this dinner, and this woman said to me, I think she thought she was a little clever. She said, "So how long have you been doing sensitivity training with the Marines?" And I said, with all due respect, I don't do sensitivity training with the Marines. I run a leadership program in the Marine Corps. Now, I know it's a bit pompous, my response, but it's an important distinction, because I don't believe that what we need is sensitivity training. We need leadership training. Because, for example, when a professional coach or manager of a baseball team or football team, and I work extensively in that realm as well, makes a sexist comment, makes a homophobic statement, makes a racist comment, there'll be discussions on the sports blogs and in sports talk radio, and some people say, well, he needs sensitivity training, and other people will say, well, get off it, that's political correctness run amok, and he made a stupid statement, move on. My argument is he doesn't need sensitivity training, he needs leadership training, because he's being a bad leader. Because in a society with gender diversity and sexual diversity, and racial and ethnic diversity, you make those kind of comments, you're failing at your leadership. If we can make this point that I'm making to powerful men and women in our society at all levels of institutional authority and power, it's going to change. It's going to change the paradigm of people's thinking. For example, I work a lot in college and university athletics throughout North America, right? We know so much about how to prevent domestic and sexual violence, right? There's no excuse for a college or university to not have domestic and sexual violence prevention training mandated for all student athletes, coaches, and administrators as part of their educational process. We know enough to know that we can easily do that, but you know what's missing? The leadership. But it's not the leadership of student athletes. It's the leadership of the athletic director, the president of the university, the people in charge who make decisions about resources and who make decisions about priorities in the institutional settings, right? That's a failure in most cases of men's leadership. Look at Penn State. Penn State is the mother of all teachable moments for the bystander approach. You had so many situations in that realm where men in powerful positions failed to act to protect children, in this case, boys. It's unbelievable, really. But when you get into it, you realize there are pressures on men. There are constraints within peer cultures on men, which is why we need to encourage men to break through those pressures. And one of the ways to do that is to say there's an awful lot of men who care deeply about these issues. I know this. I work with men, and I've been working with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men for many, many decades now. It's scary when you think about it, how many years. But there's so many men who care deeply about these issues, but caring deeply is not enough. We need more men with the guts, with the courage, with the strength, with the moral integrity to break our complicit silence and challenge each other and stand with women, not against them. By the way, we owe it to women. There's no question about it, but we also owe it to our sons. We also owe it to young men who are growing up all over the world in situations where they didn't make the choice to be a man in a culture that tells them that manhood is a certain way. They didn't make the choice. We that have a choice have an opportunity and a responsibility to them as well. I hope that going forward, men and women working together can begin the change and the transformation that'll happen so that future generations won't have the level of tragedy that we deal with on a daily basis. I know we can do it. We can do better. Thank you very much.
I'm really looking forward to hearing your reflections on that. What do you do if you suspect intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Listen and believe someone who reports it. Safety is critical, so keep her and her children safe. Encourage and build her up. Do not be critical. Never judge. Develop a safety plan. Use code words, a form of contact. It's not always safe to call someone who's a victim of domestic violence because the perpetrator sometimes holds their phone so that they limit who they talk to, or they check their contacts and they check the activity on the phone. So it's important to have some kind of plan that is not going to be found out. I've included a domestic violence safety plan worksheet as one of the attachments on the weekly checklist, so you can check that out. You should always have a copy of that available to you. You can also find it online. Seek supervision immediately. You don't want to handle anything that's tricky like this by yourself. Definitely involve your supervisor. Call a domestic violence hotline with or without the victim present to get guidance. They would know how to handle things like this. Reassure her that the abuse is not her fault and that you will get support for her. And if there are children involved, you must file a 51A. A 51A is with DCF. It's a form that reports childhood abuse. Witnessing domestic violence is a form of child abuse. So you must report if children have witnessed domestic violence. And that doesn't have to be, only physical. It could be a severe verbal abuse. So what's tricky here is if you have a couple or a family that's coming in for family counseling, which this rarely happens because perpetrators of domestic violence don't usually put themselves in a vulnerable place right now like that. But if that ever happens, you have to be very careful on how you tread, because if the victim says something that upsets the perpetrator after your session, there could be serious problems. So you have to tread lightly and then try to have individual sessions with each of them. So whenever I see a couple, I always have, see them together, and then I say, okay, the next session I'm going to meet 30 minutes with you and 30 minutes with you, or whatever. And then you can kind of get the full story and you can make a game plan. Childhood abuse. This is also a huge problem with families with someone using substances. 25% of child abuse victims were from drug-using homes. In 2016, 7.4 million children were alleged to have been abused or neglected. There's a lot of studies that show that neglect is actually worse than abuse on the mental and brain development of children. Parents are the perpetrators of the child abuse about 80% of the time. It seems like it's more prevalent in white culture than in Hispanic and African American. And like I said earlier, witnessing intimate partner violence may be almost as damaging to a child's development as being the victim herself or himself. Witnessing domestic violence is a form of child abuse. I missed something important. 61,000 cases of childhood sexual abuse. 48% of victims were 12 or older. So I'm going to go back to childhood abuse. Most cases are, the younger the children, the higher the amounts of childhood abuse is happening. As the kids get older, the abuse seems to either wane off, or children aren't around as much, so they're not abused as much, or they find different places to go for safety, or maybe the perpetrator kind of stops abusing, or they stop reporting. When it comes to childhood sexual abuse, that is a scary number. I work with a lot of adults who have been sexually abused as children. The memories they're always there if they were abused, but there can be a protective part that doesn't want to go there and talk about it. Childhood sexual abuse is super confusing for people, for children and even adults who are trying to process those memories. It's definitely a traumatic event or traumatic events. But if the abuse goes on for a while, it can become part of their belief system, and it's very confusing because there's some nice feelings that go along with sexual abuse. For a lot of children who are neglected, that may be some of the only touch or attention they get, and so they can look at it as being special or feeling good about it. And then there's this part of them that knows that it didn't feel good, and so they're very complicated feelings that go with it. There's a lot of shame, shame that it happened, shame that they didn't report it, shame that there were parts of it that felt good, that made them feel special or made them feel like they were worthy of love, which are all like natural childhood feelings, right? Children just, the only thing a kid needs is love, unconditional love, a sense of belonging, that they're worthy of love and belonging. And so all of those things get confused during sexual abuse. So if you are suspicious of childhood abuse or sexual abuse, it's your responsibility to assess during all of your sessions to make sure that there aren't things that are coming up that are indicators. So you kind of assess at intake and throughout therapy. Violence may be a part of the family's homeostasis or culture. However, it's still illegal, unethical, wrong, and it needs to be addressed. And it's not addressed if it's childhood abuse, whether it's physical or sexual. It's not addressed by you. You report it to Department of Children and Families. So you can ask these hard questions, and if the answers are yes, then you need to take steps to make sure that everybody's safe. You're obligated to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So children, disabled, and elderly. So a child is anyone under the age of 18. They are protected. They are a protected group of people. Anyone who is disabled is also in a protected group of people, and anyone over the age of 60, I think it is. We'll look on the sheet that's coming up. There's limits of confidentiality. You are ethically responsible to support suspected abuse of children, elderly, and people with disabilities. If you work in the field of substance use disorder treatment, you're a mandated reporter. You're not an investigator. If you have any knowledge, you're obligated to take action, and that means reporting. There's a whole agency to investigate, but you are not an investigator. You need to report if you have a suspicion. This is when to call. This is the standards, and it's a mere suspicion. And these are the different phone numbers to report abuse or neglect. So a child at risk hotline, they're open 24 hours a day, and that's 0 to 18. I'm sorry, but it does not include the age of 18. It's under 18. Once you're 18, you're an adult. And then disabled persons protection is 18 to 59. So if someone's disabled, they're a child, then you call the child at risk. And if they're over the age of 18 and they're disabled, you call the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. And then over the age of 60. So it's 60 and over. If someone reports abuse or neglect and they're not disabled, and they're between the ages of 18 and 59, there is no mandated reporting. So you would have to try to help that person get resources and counsel them into treatment and safety, because people between the ages of 18 and 59 who are not in one of these protected groups have agency over themselves to make decisions, even if it's staying in an abusive relationship. And that can be really hard. So try to get them all the help you can through domestic violence hotlines and things like that, so that they know they have choices. In Massachusetts, anyone can go to an emergency room for domestic violence, and the ER will hold them until a bed at a domestic violence shelter is found. So just so that you know that anybody can go to an ER. Fetal alcohol abuse syndrome disorder. So it happens when there's heavy consumption of alcohol. These are the worst cases are death. Neurodevelopmental disorders and intellectual disabilities are not as severe, but also very severe. And then birth defects, problems with organs or bodily functions. alcohol is a really, really poisonous drug. And so whenever whenever you're ingesting alcohol, you're actually drinking poison. And it is just about the worst thing you can do to a developing fetus, is drink alcohol. Luckily, there's been a lot of education around this, so it doesn't seem to be as big of a problem as it used to be. But there still are enough cases out there that we should keep educating. Drug-dependent infants, there's some issues with cocaine, and those are all listed. And then there's issues with opioids. There's been some new treatment that's changed recently in this population of children who are dependent on drugs when they're born, and it's pretty fascinating. I actually learned about this at a UMass conference a few months ago on substance use disorder. Hospitals are now, they're not medicating babies like they used to. Remove the baby from the mother and then medicate them with opioids and then wean them off of them while they're in the neonatal ICU. And those usually lasted around 26 days or so, 28 days in the hospital. And because there was so much demand, because there were so many babies being born dependent on opioids, they've started trying to not medicate the babies, but instead let the baby stay with the mother and nurse anytime the baby was irritable, which is very, very frequently. And they're now able to discharge the babies with the mothers about 6 days later with no medication. So that's a pretty huge change there. And it also just goes to show, like, humans are wired for healing. Like, our bodies and our brains are programmed to do it. And if we just kind of follow nature's course sometimes, we will heal from all of these injuries, whether they're emotional or physical. With the right kind of interventions, we can heal. Criminality, this is a new section in the book. It wasn't in here in the last edition, but it was a nice addition. So there's 27% of people in treatment for substance use disorder have been engaged in criminal behavior. 64% in police custody. These aren't really surprising numbers. And I wonder how many people who have not had a substance use disorder have been engaged in criminal behavior at some time in their lives. Anyway, there are 6 levels of involvement with a family when there's criminality involved, and those are listed. They're also in the book. Dual diagnosis, comorbidity, co-occurring disorders. It's all the same it's all the same thing, just different words. 43% of people with substance use disorder have a co-occurring disorder. That's 8.2 million people. I am a trauma specialist, and so I look at everything from a trauma lens, and I haven't really seen anyone with a substance use disorder that didn't have some sort of trauma. So I'm of a believer that it's a much, much higher number than 43%. What to treat first? There's partial, so you treat either one. There's sequential, where you treat them one after another. And then there's parallel, where you treat them both at the same time. My approach is to treat them both at the same time, because otherwise it's the chicken and the egg, and they just they'll kind of trigger each other. And in my perspective as a trauma specialist, the people that I see with substance use disorder, it's a symptom of the trauma. So it's a coping skill, so that they don't have to feel the pain. They can numb memories, or they can numb just body sensations that are uncomfortable because the trauma is held in the body. And so that's kind of how I look at it. That's my lens, but that's not everyone's. Personality disorder, it's not really covered, but I just thought it would be good to let you know about this, because there's a lot of people with borderline personality disorder that you're going to see in treatment. It's something that it's an energy you feel from people. It's this push-pull, like, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. That's a personality disorder. Personality disorders are believed to be from early childhood attachment issues. These people have very disorganized attachments, and that's where they kind of come from. And a lot of people in the field will say, I don't want to work with people with BPD. I don't want to work with people who, who have this diagnosis. And it's just not right. They're suffering and they need help. They can be really challenging to work with. I actually really do like working with them. A lot of them, if they have severe symptoms, they won't stick around for long because it's too much for them to tolerate treatment. But they're an interesting group, and the energy is very interesting. Okay, and this is the Stages of Change model, which I think we went over before. I'm not sure. But it starts with pre-contemplation, then it goes to contemplation, then determination and planning, then action, and then relapse is possible at any time, but it does not have to be a part of a change. Not everyone relapses. And then it's maintenance, and again, relapse can happen anytime. I love this model because it really gives you a great framework for working with people with substance use disorder. When I first started, I remember going to my first practicum placement, meeting people who were contemplative and thinking, oh, I'm going to help them get right into action. And that doesn't happen. So it was really helpful to have this framework and understand that my job, if I'm working for someone with someone who doesn't think they have a problem, I'm not moving them from pre-contemplation to abstinence, which is action, right? I'm moving them from pre-contemplation to contemplation. That's it. That's what my goal is on that session. And then once I get to contemplation, okay, now I can move to determination and planning, and then action. Okay, and here's a little riddle for you. There are 2 frogs on a log, and one decides to jump to the other log. How many are left on the first log? I'll just give you a second to think about that. Okay, you can pause it if you want, because the answer is there are 2 frogs on the log, because that one decided to jump, but he actually didn't jump. He just decided to jump. So that is the stage that seems to be the hardest between the determination and planning and actually putting that into practice. And then handouts for you. So I've attached a whole bunch of handouts that will be helpful to you when taking the midterm and final, because the midterm is going to be coming up in a couple weeks, and also when you're working in the field. So here is a whole bunch of them. There's domestic violence safety plan. You can also get that online, but it's just really nice to have it handy in your files. Individual safety plan. I just I use the same one, and I just deleted my information from it, so you can fill it in with your own stuff. Motivational interviewing cheat sheet. I know you did the little video about motivational interviewing, and the cheat sheet will help you kind of as well. And case conceptualization, considering content versus process. And I put those handouts in the weekly checklist. And I think that's it. So I hope you have a great week, and reach out if you need help. Thanks. Bye.